This is Kelly M., and you're on the Common Surface. And we are blessed to have Dr. Joseph P. Farrell with us. Dr. Farrell has a PhD in patristics from the University of Oxford, has published nearly 40 books, and a new one coming out shortly. So Joseph's on the line right now. Welcome, Joseph.
Hi, Kelly. Thanks for having me back.
You're welcome. It seems like things are moving geopolitically
Hmm.
apace right now.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, both for good and for bad. It seems like good is getting stronger and evil is getting stronger at the same time, or at least the
Hmm.
evil actions. The
Hmm.
evil actions are the amplitude is going up on both sides.
Right.
And so how is Mr. Global doing right now?
Well, from my point of view, I think he's exhibiting signs of desperation, and that's chiefly due to the rise of so much populism around the world, and it's a very interesting kind of populism that I think we're seeing. It's rooted not so much in patriotism, but culture. And you see it everywhere. You see it in India, Latin America, certainly in North America, Europe. It's pretty much everywhere. People do not subscribe basically to the far left woke cultural Marxist agenda that Mr. Globalone has been feeding them, and they're reacting to it.
Yeah,
But
I mean, my daughter and I saw a Disney movie like 3 or 4 years ago, and I said we're never watching anything by Disney anymore.
yeah, I don't blame you. It you know
Yeah.
you go to the movies and you get preached at constantly, and it's the same thing with the lamestream propaganda media, and people are just sick of it. We saw the results, in this last election, and I've got bad news for Mr. Globalone. If they think the last election was just an ordinary political election and that they're going to regain a lot of ground that they lost, I don't think that's the case. I think it was a cultural bellwether election. That coalition that Mr. Trump put together will remain together if they have a leader capable of holding it together. And I think the same thing is true in Europe. We just saw the collapse of the French government and Marine Le Pen waiting in the wings. We're watching the collapse of the Schultz chancellorship and his coalition government. And again, you've
Is-
got kind of a populist party waiting in the wings in Germany. So it's pretty much everywhere.
Yeah, and what are the characteristics, the cultural characteristics that people are not just reacting negatively to woke, they're also embracing something cultural.
Yes,
And
yes.
what do you think they're embracing?
Well, to the degree that they're informed and able to do so, they're embracing so-called what I would call so-called traditional virtues. I don't even like to use the term values because that's kind of itself a collapse of virtue. But they're embracing the idea basically that there is transcendence, that there is something called good and evil, that there is something called beauty and ugliness, and so on and so forth. And they're trying to get back to that. And the problem in that I see in the West is that the core of those virtues, which is our religious heritage, has been all but hollowed out in most of the churches of the West. So the problem in the West, unlike let's say India, where you have similar types of movements, or in Latin America where you have the Roman Catholic Church that is still very present in people's consciousness, or Russia or the Ukraine where you have orthodoxy as kind of the pin to ground those cultural aspirations. In the West, we don't have that. So it does take on a different flavor in the West, and that's just the cultural aspects. In terms of raw geopolitics, the other thing that is happening is that it's apparent to everyone, including, I think, in the quiet corridors of power in this country, it's apparent to everyone that the days of the Pax Americana, the unipolar American hegemonic world and empire, are over. And the simple fact of the matter is we simply can't afford it. And the other problem with the American hegemon right now, Kelly, at least the way I see it, is that the cultural rot that we talked about, the cultural rot has spread into the American military, so that the American military, if you compare the people that would have to do the fighting in the military, let's say, God forbid we go end up in a major war with Russia. Well, unfortunately, my money is not on the American military to carry the day in that one, because the cultural rot is, and President-elect Trump has singled this out. He does not want a woke military because he knows that it will not be an effective fighting force, particularly against a peer rival like Russia or China. So geopolitically, things are in a mess, and you're seeing the other actors on the world stage take advantage of the situation. So Mr. Globalone is in a world of hurt, but at the same time, he's been able to recover somewhat. The toppling of the Assad regime in Syria is certainly a blow to Russia and by extension to the rest of the BRICS nations, and it's certainly something that has shored up Mr. Globalone's position, because that was done with Israeli and Turkish cooperation.
Yeah, that was
And
wild.
yeah, that's totally wild.
Yeah.
Yeah, this would not have happened without major Turkish cooperation. And in doing so, Mr. Erdogan has basically turned his back on Russia. And that's another bellwether, because what it also showed is that Russia, while it is capable of sustaining a massive military effort, it is only capable of doing so against one target at a time, so to speak. So they're preoccupied in the Ukraine, and hence the Russian support for Mr. Assad collapsed. So there's the dominoes are falling and ricocheting all over the place.
I heard Alistair Cook recently on uh, Judge Napolitano's podcast, and he
Right,
was saying that what happened was that that Assad, who of course represents the Alawite coalition in Syria, which is a minority
right,
population,
right,
and was selected because it was a minority population back in
right,
the 20th century, uh, because basically they had to be nice to everybody, or they would lose their power, right?
right.
And that Russia actually, offered to Assad to retrain and rebolster and refinance their military, and Assad turned him down.
Yeah, I can believe that. I have not heard that, but I can believe it. And if he did, then he has just suffered the consequences to it. The other thing culturally that the collapse of his regime means in Syria is, unfortunately, that the Christian population of that country is up for grabs. And this is the other thing geopolitically and culturally I think people really need to latch on to, because this would not have happened without the green light from the American government. That's just the way it is. And the way I view it is, if that's the case, then the American government just chose sides, and it
Wow.
did not choose the right side, as far as I'm concerned.
Now there was talk, over the last 10 years about running gas pipelines up from the
Right,
Gulf
right.
through Iraq and through Syria into
Through Syria,
Turkey.
right, right.
And what do you think that played a role
Oh,
in?
absolutely, I do. Absolutely, I do. Uh, it basically is a move that was designed. There were essentially three routes: one from Saudi Arabia through Syria into Turkey and then Europe. The other coming in a more direct east to west line, either through Syria and Turkey, from China through Syria and Turkey up into Europe, or running it from Syria into the Eastern Mediterranean, and then from there up into the Balkans into Europe. But basically, all of those routes are either going through or very close to Syria. So it was geopolitically, and in my opinion, this is also about oil. It's not just a cultural play here. It's an oil play.
Right.
And the West, if if you if you look at the West and its actions over the last several decades, the West's goal has been basically to achieve a kind of monopoly position in control of the bulk, and please note what I'm saying there, the bulk of the world's petroleum supplies. That's been the goal. And Russia has been the one country, and then Venezuela later on, that has stood in the way of that, and hence the hatred of Russia. So on and on we could go.
So, there was a major natural gas find off the coast of Gaza.
Is Yep, yep.
And I wonder if that was the part of the energy play. The reason why Israel got behind it is because it gives them a route for their oil, for their gas into Europe.
Well, I let me put it this way. I certainly view the attack of Hamas on Israelis on October 7th last uh, as as just a barbaric and terrible thing. It was a
No doubt.
genocidal act. However, what it did is, I think, Hamas dramatically miscalculated, Kelly, in launching that attack, because essentially what it did was it handed Israel the excuse to launch the military operation that they have launched. And as far as I can tell from the way the Israeli military is behaving, which again I think it's much of its behavior is barbaric, but the way it's behaving looks to me like the real goal is precisely as you aver, to clear out the Gaza Strip and make it secure enough for Israel itself to have a monopoly position on those resources and to be able to develop them. So,
No doubt.
it was a crisis of opportunity, I think, that Israel seized upon. Um, and again, under the circumstances of an attack like they went through, uh, you can understand their thinking in doing so. My problem with the whole situation has always been, I simply fail to see how the Israeli military and security forces did not know that that attack was coming, because that's one of the most secure and technologically, at that time, technologically sophisticated borders in the world. Underground motion sensors and seismic detectors, and that border was locked down technologically in every way that Israel had available. So I question whether or not they did not know that that was coming. And my suspicion is that there was a let it happen on purpose scenario at work there. What I think did, if that is the case, and I'm making my circumstantial argument that that may have been the case. Um, if that is the case, then I think the surprise element for the Israelis was not necessarily that it happened, but rather the degree and sheer barbarity of the attack itself that caught them by surprise. So there's a lot going on here that to my mind is very fishy with respect to the whole situation in Israel and Syria and now Turkey. And we can add on top of that, Iran, I think, is as a result of all of this, Iran is in a very delicate position. Um, there's rumors that the current Ayatollah is not well physically and health wise. There are these reports that there's an Iranian mothership behind the drones that
Yeah.
we're hearing about. It's getting kind of wild. But my
Is the
point,
mothership wearing a hijab?
well, yes, this is exactly, and The other problem here is that we've just seen an understanding, an entente between Israel and Turkey vis-a-vis Syria. Well, it remains to be seen how that is going to play out vis-a-vis Iran. But if I were Iran, the last thing in the world I would want to see happen is for that relationship to continue to be cozy. Turkey, like it or not, is one of the major players in the region, and it if it came to a conflict between Iran and Turkey, my money would be on the Turks.
Yeah, they have a really substantial army and they know how to use it.
They have a very substantial military. They have a long tradition in Turkey of uh, military affairs and doctrine and tradition going all the way back, of course, to the Ottoman Empire. So they are fierce, fierce fighters, and no one should doubt that for a minute. So it's a rickety position. Plus, we have to remember that in Iran, when the Ayatollahs took power, they booted out essentially a very corrupt, very wicked, evil regime in the Shah. But the other thing that we need to remember about the Shah's regime is that, in spite of its own barbarities and cruelties, Iran was uh, a very secular, very pro-Western state. It was not trying to live under Sharia law, and the Iranians, as far as I can recall from that period, the Iranians, for the most part, liked living that way. So the
Right.
current regime is, you're dealing with memories in Iran, and the current regime could literally be changed at a moment's notice, because I can't see the Iranian people, suffering long and continuing under this current step backwards into the Middle Ages.
Yeah, so one of the things I also noticed about Syria, well, you have the Kurds in the northeastern corner of Syria, which
Right,
of course claim a significant part of Turkey,
right,
as well as northern Iraq.
right.
And then you have in the southwest corner, you have the Druze,
Hmm.
uh, right? And so there was a report that the Druze were negotiating with Israel to be annexed by the state of Israel,
I
which would
wouldn't
take
doubt it.
which would take them about 40 miles from Damascus.
Yeah, I wouldn't doubt that at all, because with the collapse, the Druze, if memory serves me correctly, much of that population is Christian. And if I were those minority Christian populations, Nestorians and Armenians and Roman Catholics and Orthodox in Syria, I'd be trying to make nice and friendly with Israel as quickly as I could, because you've got a radical Islamist group of people taking power in that country.
Yeah, I
So,
noticed that the justice minister was praising Allah. The new
mhm.
Syrian justice minister was praising Allah in such a way that made me think that he was an absolute fanatic.
Yeah, yeah, it's this is something else that the West is going to have to wrap their brains around, that uh, there is a curious thing in Islam. Allah in Arabic is simply the Arabic word for God. In other words, it's not a proper name, but it tends to be understood that way by most Muslims, and therefore most Westerners looking at it. But Arab Christians also pray to Allah. In other
Right.
words, I'm Eastern Orthodox, and I was converted in an Arabic church.
Wow.
So the first Orthodox prayers I learned were not in Greek or Russian; they were in Arabic.
Wow.
So, and that's how you would pray. You would pray, Kudusan Allah, Kudusan Ilkawi, Kudusan Ilajdi Lama Yuterhamna, and it never occurred to you that you were praying to the Muslim God. That's what I'm trying
Well,
to get across here. So you can be an Arab Christian, but in the context that you're suggesting, yeah, you get a new justice minister, and he's coming out of this cultural milieu of Islam, and hearing him praising God is going to send, it's going to send certain messages to people. And it's not going to be the same kind of message that you would hear from a Muslim justice minister under the Assad regime, where that individual using the term God would be understood in a very different way by the local Syrian Christian population. This is what I'm getting at. It's
Yeah.
depending on who is saying it. So yeah, I'm with you. I understand why you're reacting that way. That he seems to be fanning the flames or beating the drum for the new administration by using the term in the way he used it. Absolutely.
Yeah. So if we see, you've heard the expression Greater Israel, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So what are the boundaries of Greater Israel, at least in people's minds?
Well, it depends on whose map you look at.
Hmm.
But the expression is from the river to the sea, and the question is what's the
Which
river?
river?
Or
Yeah.
which river are we talking about? Is it the Nile River?
Is it the
Well,
Jordan?
is it the Jordan? Is it the Tigris and Euphrates?
Right.
Exactly which river are we talking about?
Yeah.
But the you know let's take worst case scenario that Greater Israel is from the Tigris Euphrates Valley to the Mediterranean. In other words, basically, Greater Israel would be the entire Fertile Crescent, and
Wow.
you can probably add Eastern Egypt east of the Nile.
Right.
so, so yeah, there's that Greater Israel. Then there's the lesser version of it that would basically be Israel as it stood after the 1967 war,
Right.
occupying all of the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and so on, and a significant portion uh, of Jordan. And the only expansion that I recall that occurred significantly after that was the early 1980s invasion of southern Lebanon. So you could add southern Lebanon to the post 1967 borders. And then, of course, we had the accords, Jimmy Carter's negotiated accords that kind of scaled back the 67 war results with Anwar Sadat. But the other thing I think is an interesting signature or signpost of the future here is I I suspect Saudi Arabia is making overtures already to get cozy with Israel once again. I don't think that portends that Saudi Arabia is going to completely drop its cozy negotiations with the BRICS nations. I don't think it means that at all. But I do think, as a result of the Syria thing, that we can expect Saudi Arabia to open those channels back up to Israel once again. Hello.
Yeah, sorry about that. I was on mute. So if you go all the way from to the Tigris and Euphrates, and
Mm-hmm.
then you go all the way back down the Nile, and maybe all the way down to Yemen,
Mm-hmm.
then you have Israel being the world's major energy producer.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
and
Uh, it
go
would
ahead.
it would be it would assume the current position that
Yeah.
that Saudi Arabia has within OPEC. The other major oil producing countries in the world would still be Venezuela, the United States, Russia, and Iran.
Hmm.
But that would basically make the West the kingpin within the oil producing countries.
Yeah, it's
Um,
very interesting.
it's a very scary, precarious situation because uh, the country that would be most hurt by that and view any such development with extreme negativity would be China, followed very quickly thereafter by Japan and India. You know, the geopolitics is such that if 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 we don't play our cards carefully And thus far, I've seen no indicator that anybody in the West is capable of being an adult in the room and playing their cards carefully. We could end up within 30 to 50 years having a complete geopolitical realignment of power because you cut off the oil to those countries and you simply drive them together.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
those are three world class economies with world class technologies, and you don't want to mess with them. You simply don't want to drive them together.
Wow. So, is part of the deal between speculating here, is part of the
Yeah.
deal between Israel and Turkey, like, is Erdogan trying to reproduce the Ottoman Empire in some
Oh, in
way?
my opinion, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I, there's no doubt in my mind, and I'll tell you why. About 12 to 15 years ago, I don't remember the exact time frame, but we were listening to a kind of uh, revival of neo-Ottoman ideas within Turkey. And I recall very vividly seeing an online magazine article that had a picture of President Erdogan in the presidential palace in Ankara coming down a just a gigantic, off the scale in terms of ritziness, coming down
Yeah.
this gigantic staircase. And I've, just the setting alone said Sultan,
Oh my
but
goodness.
but Erdogan was dressed. This is the real kicker. Erdogan was dressed in this. I don't know what it was, Kelly. It was clearly some sort of costume, and it was in brocade with gold embroidery and leafing, and it was purple.
Whoa.
So in other words, to me, it was Erdogan signaling that, yeah, he's the Sultan now, and he's the one calling the shots.
Wow.
And the imagery alone is what convinced me that there was something going on with Turkey. Well, as it turns out, if you've been following some of the more obscure and off the wall scuttlebutt surrounding what's going on right now, not only is there talk about greater Israel, there's also talk about greater Turkey. And there's people that want to expand Turkey back into the Balkan Peninsula.
Whoa.
Edom as Greece and Bulgaria, number one, and then Macedonia. Um,
Yeah. And
and
Bosnia Herzegovina, which of course has a huge Sunni
has a
population.
huge Sunni population. So yeah, this could get real bad and real nasty because, of course, I don't think people are remembering the lessons of history. The Balkan Wars of the late 1910s, prior to World War One breaking out, those Balkan Wars were actually wars that were fought to liberate those countries from Ottoman rule,
Yeah.
particularly Greece and Bulgaria and southern Serbia. So this you have Turkey moving into those countries again and taking advantage of the weakness, and there's going to be trouble. So I don't put much stock in all this talk of a revived Ottoman Empire in Europe, but I do put stock in it in terms of what Turkey wants to accomplish with, as you pointed out, the minority Kurds in the region. They still have it out for the Armenians that are within Turkish borders. We all remember that genocide from World War
Right.
One. So yeah, and there are parts of Turkey that uh, they would dearly like to see in northern Syria annexed to Turkey as well. So we could see a kind of neo-Ottomanism in that sense, absolutely. And
Wow.
it's going to disguise itself as Turkish zones of occupation. In other words, they're not going to come right out and annex it.
Right.
They're gonna administer it behind these precedents that the Versailles Treaty established in that region of the world. Well, if France can administer Syria, Turkey can administer parts of Syria. That sort of thinking.
So how do you think the Sykes-Picot declaration is holding up now?
Oh, it's not. It's
Yeah.
not. Absolutely not. But that again, you mentioned Sykes-Picot because I think it's important for people to understand that the West itself established the precedent for what we're now seeing. The regional powers, Turkey and Israel, particularly in that part of the world, beginning to do. So in other words, we can't go back and say, well, it's not international law to do this sort of thing because all they have to do is point to Sykes-Picot and say, on the
Yeah.
contrary, you did it before. you know,
Right.
you sat up
Yeah.
there in Paris and drew your lines on the map and created these countries that don't work. Now we're taking over and there's nothing you can do about it because we're back to square one. The American hegemon is not what it used to be. We can't afford it. Our
Right.
military is our best military equipment is being decimated by the Russians in the Ukraine.
Right.
And okay, who's going to want to buy your equipment?
Right.
So on and on this goes. We're watching the dominoes collapsing, and it's all every last bit of it. This is what I want people to come away with, if nothing else. Every last bit of this is the West's fault and primarily America's fault. The Ukraine, all of it is the consequences of our ill considered neocon foreign policy. And it's coming back to bite us.
Yeah. How do you think the neocons are doing in the United States now? Are they seeing their power recede? That's the way I see it.
I see their power is receding at the popular level. People know who they are, but I don't see it. Uh,
Translate into policy.
I don't see it. Well, I don't see it translating into policy. And the biggest policy it needs to translate into is the imperial city state that Americans live under, Swampington, D.C. Uh, it will not change unless the power of the bureaucratic government is broken. The administrative state, the regulative state, that has to be broken. Otherwise,
Hmm.
uh, in 4 years, we're going to watch it come back, either under the next Republican administration or the next, God help us, Democratic administration. It'll come roaring back, and it'll be even more insane than anything that we've seen yet. That entity, whatever you want to call it,
The blob.
uh, the blob, yeah, the blob. That entity is stupid, narcissistic, and unrepentant. It has not learned a thing. And it
Wow.
won't. It in my opinion, Kelly, it is incapable of learning. This is the problem. It literally has to be culturally changed, and that's the difficulty I don't see anyone addressing is uh, the whole neocon culture has to be changed. It's the technocratic outlook that we can run the world simply through process and scientific reasoning and so on and so forth. Well, unfortunately, most of the world's cultures are not based on that. And
Right.
that's why that whole approach is breaking down. And it
Right.
will cause massive trouble. And this is particularly the case with Russia. I don't care. I'm gonna shout this from the housetops until I'm blue in the face. Modern Russia is an authoritarian state. It is also a democratic state. It is also a federative state, and it is not a neo-Stalinist or a neo-communist state.
It also has a theocratic component.
It has that's my point.
Yeah.
It is not a continuation of the Soviet Union. They
Hmm.
went through their technocratic phase and rejected it.
Hmm.
So, I've said over and over again, Russia is engaged in an experiment of being the world's first postmodern state.
Yep.
So in
Civilization even.
It's a civilizational state. And
Yep.
in that sense, it is not behind the United States, or for that matter, communist China, or what's left of Europe. It is ahead of them. And it is tailoring its policy accordingly. And we in the West, especially in the West, don't get that. Xi Jinping gets it. And the simple reason he gets it is, try as the communists might in China, the underlying cultural foundation of that whole country, of that whole culture, is still Confucian.
Right.
So, it
And Taoist.
and Taoist,
Yeah.
exactly. So, you have this veneer of communism that was slapped onto China, as you had the veneer of communism that was slapped onto Russia. And that veneer of technocracy and process and scientific reason and enlightenment didn't work.
Yeah.
The only place it could possibly work and take root and grow in all of its Gramscian and Frankfurt School malignancy is in the West, and here we are. you know?
Wow. Yeah, it's kind of unbelievable to see how long and how effective that neo-Marxist Gramscian malaise, how long, how well it's taken root, and
Oh
nobody
yes.
did anything about it for way too long.
Well, there was one who tried, and we know what his name is, and no one likes to talk about him. But
Right.
anyway, yeah,
Yeah.
and the sad thing is that even he was not really uh clued into the nature of the cultural Gramscian version of Marxism. He understood that there was a cultural aspect to it, but he didn't understand how deeply it went, and
Yeah, of
how
course,
poisonous it
we're
was.
yeah, we're talking about, for the audience, we're talking about Senator Joseph McCarthy.
Right,
The
right.
old "I have in my hand a list" guy.
I have in my hand, yeah. Um, and not so much even Senator McCarthy. You could name some other players in that era too.
Yeah,
Senator McCarran, and certainly Carol Reese, the chairman of the House Committee on Foundations, another huge part of this story. But
right.
um, America has allowed this poison. We see it now, that it has metastasized throughout all of the cultural institutions of our country and of
Yep.
our civilization. Pardon me. It's metastasized through the media. It is metastasized through the Quackademy. It has metastasized, especially and primarily, the cancer spread from the churches. So those three institutions, were set up for the infiltration, and nobody did anything about it. There were a few voices that were trying to warn that this is happening, but they were, pardon me, they were shouted down or ignored, back in the 40s, actually 20s, 30s, and 40s, when they first started to notice these things and try to bring people's attention to it.
Right.
So it's been underway for a very long time. And now that it's all but successfully penetrated all of those institutions, I can think of one quackademic institution that I know of that has national fame that I would trust not to be a co-opted institution. And there's a few more on the regional level, but that's it. If you're talking Harvard or Princeton, Yale, Stanford, Columbia, University of Chicago, Michigan, all of those places are gone. They're bulwarks of nuttery and wokery, and that's just quackademia. We saw what the media is in this last presidential cycle, and it is even worse when you look at the churches, and most people don't, but that's where it started, and that's where it spread from. So I don't see the West as in good shape. Mr. Globaloney, on that analysis, if he can hold things together and maintain his grip power and his grip on those institutions, I would say for maybe another 10 to 20 years he'll make it.
Right.
Um, but it's this interim game that we're in right now that could blow up in everybody's faces. All it takes is one miscalculation. And
Yeah.
the West miscalculate.
When have we ever known them to do that?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Precisely. When have we ever known them to do that?
Since
Precisely.
their objective is to lose wars, they're at about 100% success rate.
They managed to get us into all sorts of wars that we can lose. But
Yeah.
the trouble is, at some point, at some point we can lose. We can lose wars against a North Korea or a Sudan or an Iraq and so on and so forth. It is an
Liechtenstein.
entirely Liechtenstein, Monaco, Luxembourg, you name it. But it's an entirely different matter when you're talking about losing wars with a Russia or China.
Right.
You know, because
They have strategic depth.
number one, they have strategic depth, precisely. And number two, they have traditions of realpolitik in those countries. Yeah, you lose a war, we'll take this XYZ provinces from you,
Right.
or we're going to impose these types of economic and military restrictions on you.
Yeah.
And they
Just
have,
ask the Nazis.
just ask the Nazis. Right, exactly. Yeah, yeah. Bye bye Germany's strategic depth on that one. So yeah, they have these traditions. So again, the West is not looking good. The only positive sign is the recent election of Mr. Trump, and already, that we're seeing signs that he's got kind of a potential neocon foreign policy agenda with some of his selections and some of his statements. Whether this proves to be true in practice, I don't know.
Yeah. It may be a
Uh,
strat. It may be a tactical,
yeah, yeah,
positioning
yeah.
to
You
get
have
through
to.
the confirmation process.
It may be. It may be. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's certainly the lesser of two evils. The Ayatollah Kamalarchy would have been an absolute disaster geopolitically.
And for
Um,
us.
and for us, absolutely, and for us, absolutely.
Yeah. So, what do you think about his cabinetry? To put it,
Trump.
to yeah,
Well, I'm pleased at some of the selections and picks. Homan, to take care of the
yeah,
border, and I don't care what people say about Mr. Hegseth. I think that we need someone that has actually fought in a war,
yeah.
in a
What a
combat
concept.
situation. Yeah, what a concept! Rather than a pencil pusher with 4 stars on his shoulder board.
Right.
Um, I
And the Brezhnev scale of medals on the chest.
Yeah, and the Brezhnev scale of medals on the chest. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Uh, uh, and it, let's thoroughly modern Millie even has the Brezhnev caterpillars for eyebrows. But anyway,
Oh
but
my God.
yeah, I'm pleased with some of them. Some of them I'm iffy about. Everybody is raging about Elon Musk and what a wonderful guy he is, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Well, this guy wants to put chips into your brain.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, ain't happening here, folks.
Yeah.
So some of the picks and selections are questionable. I do like Bobby Kennedy at uh, health and so on.
HHS. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that immensely because, for one thing, it brings a Kennedy back into a cabinet level federal position,
Yep.
and I'm excited about that because, say what you will, anybody in a cabinet level position has an influence on policy, and we need a Kennedy to be influencing the declassification of JFK.
Yep.
This country has to move beyond JFK, and it will not be able to do so until we know what's in those archives. It may be nothing, but we need to know nonetheless what's in those archives because the
Yeah,
country will never move on from that coup d'état until we do.
yeah, it's like a boogeyman,
It's a boogeyman that hangs over the country,
right?
and it needs to quit. Plus, having Mr. Kennedy in there, I'm hopeful that he'll be able to do something to start. And please notice I say start the process of reversing the poisoning of our food supply and turning over our medical drugs to big pharma.
Yeah,
Uh, we are the sickest country in the world. We spend the most on healthcare, and look what we get for it. We get nothing,
yeah.
and it's got to stop. It's got to stop.
I was taking my daughter to school and I pointed up at the nearby, medical complex, and
Hmm.
they're building like two or three buildings up there on the hill.
Hmm.
And I said to my daughter, I say, when you see the number of buildings being reduced, that
Hmm.
means the people are healthy. And if you see them putting
Right.
more and more buildings up, that means the people are getting sicker.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's not a healthcare industry.
No.
It's a disease promotion industry. That's
And
how
yeah,
they make their money, by keeping you sick.
right. Right. It's a promotion of vice in the
Right. It
healthcare
is.
space.
It is. It is. And
Yeah.
so and Mr. Kennedy, whatever else you say about some of his other policy positions, at least on this score, he's been saying and warning about these things publicly for years.
And been right
So
about almost every one of
and
them.
been right about, yes, been right about almost every one of them.
And he's
So,
a lawyer, so he knows how to
and
use language.
he's a lawyer, he knows how to use language, and he knows how to use the law to go after these people. So
Right.
again, I think that's a good pick. Um, some of the sub cabinet level picks I think are also interesting. Cash Patel for the FBI.
Yeah.
I'm just if there's an agency of the Department of Justice that really needs to have a good house cleaning and several people given their walking papers, it's that one,
Yeah.
because we're dealing with corruption that has been part of that agency ever since its founding and first
Yep.
director.
Yep.
So it needs to be cleaned out. So,
Yeah.
good luck, Mr. Patel. It's not a job I would want, but if anyone can do it, or at least make a beginning of it. So some of his picks, in other words, I'm getting at here is that some of his picks are good, and it's going to be interesting to see how they fare.
Yeah, well, he put some of the victims in charge of the things that victimized,
Right. Right. Exactly.
which is
Exactly.
brilliant in its and simple in its own way.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And there's Tulsi Gabbard, who I'm a
Right.
little I like her, but you know I'm not so sure that she's the infighter that we need in that position of DNI.
What was she? DNI.
Yeah,
I yeah. I She and Governor Noam. I'm cautious about.
yeah,
Um, uh, Governor Noah much more actually than Tulsi Gabbard,
hmm,
but some of the picks are interesting at the level of agency.
hmm,
Homan at the border, I think, is going to do exactly what he says he's going to do,
hmm,
and no holds barred. I'm much more concerned coming into this administration about foreign policy than I am domestic issues. We're
yeah,
forgetting, all the scuttlebutt domestically is about how Trump has basically 2 years to get accomplished what he needs to get accomplished. That, and they're looking forward to a Democratic sweep in 2 years, which may or may not happen. I don't know. But what I'm getting at here is, I think people are to use Bush Jr.'s horrible, mangled expression, misunderestimating what a Trump lame duck presidency is going to look like. Because he doesn't have to keep the gloves on anymore after that. And I think that could really be the most interesting part of this incoming administration, is not the first 2 years, but the last 2 years of it. So we'll see.
And of course, we know that being president is not an entry level position.
Right. Well, yes, exactly. We learned that lesson the first time around, but neither is it a position for people that have made political careers out of 50 years of grifting the United States Senate and sniffing
Yeah.
air. I just
Yeah.
it's not a position for avatars. In other
Have
words,
have we reached maximum criminality?
um, you know, after the Bush family and the Clintons, I thought, well, it can't get much worse than this. And then we had the Obamas, and then I thought, well, it can't possibly get much worse than this. And now we've had Biden Joe. Um, this man has set new levels of incompetence, stupidity, criminality, fraud. Um, if I were a member of that family, I'd hang my head in shame, and if I were Mrs. Biden, I'd go back to using my maiden name.
Yeah.
I, I wouldn't want to be associated with the family at all. Mm-mm.
You just you there's no bottom. It's sort of like
Right.
a perfect vacuum.
Well, it's quicksand
Yeah.
it's quicksand with no bottom. It's just a horrible smelling muck that uh, seems to be subsuming everyone that it comes in contact with. This,
His major personality characteristic is vindication.
yeah, it is. He's just a mean, nasty, stupid, wicked, evil, grifting old man.
Yeah.
There is. I cannot think of one redeeming thing to say about him.
And he turned
Um,
his kid into his bag man.
yeah, he turned his own son into his bagman. I, you know, it we haven't seen this kind of criminality in a chief executive since Lyndon Baines Johnson, and
Yeah.
that's saying a lot, folks.
Yeah.
It's just
Yeah.
unreal. It's just unreal. So it's no wonder to me that America's stock in the world is so low, and it's no wonder to me that we're in this, Kelly, we're in the strangest transition in American politics I've ever seen.
It's historic in American history for sure.
Where is the transition? It's almost as if Biden has just shuffled off the stage and Trump has taken over all the functioning duties of the presidency. We're not even seeing the vice president step in. You would
Yeah.
think that she would do something to
Yeah.
alleviate the catastrophe of the presidency not even being functional. But
Right.
she's apparently too busy, with her wine coolers or something. I don't know. So
Wine
Trump,
coolers.
so Trump is actually acting as far as I can tell, as the de facto president. The world leaders are calling him. He's calling the world leaders. He's having the press conferences, and he's the one that's being invited here and there. And since when has any transitional period and a president elect done that?
Yeah,
I
it
I
takes
can't
quite a
think of any.
vacuum. Takes
Yeah,
quite a
it
vacuum. Yeah.
it takes a huge vacuum to
Yeah.
create, and the problem is it's raising all of those speculations that people had 4 years ago. Well, Biden's not the real president. Trump is exercising the presidency in secret. The nuclear football is still in his hands.
Yeah.
Um, you know, well, here we are, and here we're in a transition that looks a whole lot like, okay, he's already president. We're just waiting for him to be sworn in.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
and
if he there was rumors that he then in March, like March 4th or March 6th of 2021, that the military recognized that he had actually won the election, and that
ugly.
really put a wrench into but into the Biden group's plans.
Well, that could very well be. There's,
Yeah.
it
And
statistics
the major piece of evidence for that, of course, was the fact that they tried to impeach him after he left office.
that number one,
Yeah.
and number two, statistically, I mean, I'm sorry, getting getting graphs to do what we were told that they did as a matter of probability and statistics is not possible. And the statistical impossibility of what happened and them telling us that it was all entirely legit. You
Yeah,
know,
that was just too much.
you can look at the graphs and see that they were lying, and they were
Right.
able to get away with it, I think, simply because most Americans are so mathematically illiterate that they cannot see a fraud when it's presented graphically to them in front of their very eyes. It was a
Right.
fraudulent, stolen election, and I said that on election night. I've said it ever since.
Yeah, you and I
And
watched the returns.
yeah, we watched the returns, and it was what they were telling us was happening was impossible. It was
Right.
fraud, because in any statistical sampling, you're going to in any truly random sampling, it's going to basically break both ways.
Yeah.
So when we're being told that, oh, 90% of those mail-in ballots are all for Biden and only 10% for Trump, no, statistically, this does not happen.
Right. I would love
You're
to see Sidney Powell selected for Assistant Attorney General for Election Integrity.
Yeah, something needs to happen to these people.
Yeah.
It was an avatar presidency brought into power by a fraudulent election,
Yeah.
and we had this grifting, incompetent, senile crook being run by a hidden Politburo.
Yeah.
And I dearly want to know who those people were and are. And the other thing that needs to be addressed, Kelly, as far as I'm concerned, is who was really in charge of the nuclear football during this whole period.
Right.
Because the reason that this country is in the position that we are now is that the other world leaders did not know who was in charge over here, and they took advantage of the situation and ran with it.
Right.
So it's a mess. This is what happens when unelected bureaucrats assume power.
Yep.
And this is why this situation in the swamp not only should be drained, it must be drained
Yep.
if there's going to be any sort of genuine national security. Period.
Yep. Yeah, it's been impossible. It's not just that the foreign, much more capable foreign leaders took advantage
Right.
of the situation. It was also they were frightened by what they saw because they didn't know what was going to
Yes.
happen next.
Right. Right. Yeah. You saw this reaction, and you still see it in Russia.
Yeah.
That the right before before all of this began to break, we started hearing from the Russians that America, and there's a specific Russian word for this, is not agreement capable.
Oh, yeah,
In
that
other words,
word. Yeah.
you cannot reach an agreement with the Americans because they'll break it. And this has been the constant position of the Russian foreign ministry ever since. They are very, very skeptical about this country, and you cannot blame them,
No,
because
we're all skeptical about it too.
we're all skeptical about it too. And at least in the case of the old Soviet Politburo, you at least knew who was on it. you know,
Yeah. Right.
Here, at best, we may think Mayorkas and um, Blinken, Blanken, Blunken, and Merrick Garland, but that's certainly not all of the current Politburo.
Well, the policies are not being set by those people. The policies are being
Right,
set in the background. So who's setting
right.
the policy?
Yes, exactly. That's the question.
Yeah, I would love to see a constitutional amendment that, or at least a law, that everybody who contributes to a bill, whether it's money, whether it's an NGO that wrote the draft, or anybody that participated in the drafting or paying for a single word in a bill, has to be made public. In other words, total transparency on bill formation.
Well, yeah, I would agree with that, but to do that, they have to get rid of the FASB 56 regulations.
Oh yeah,
And
that's the other thing that nobody's talked about.
that nobody's talking about. Catherine Fitz is the only one that you and I
Yeah,
know that has publicly raised this issue.
right,
And we're not, it needs to be front and center. And as far as I can tell, it ain't in
right.
this incoming administration. So until, it's FASB 56 that for me, Kelly, is the big reason I'm mostly skeptical of the incoming
Right.
administration, because until that's addressed, then it's going to be it's going to be more big state, deep state, entrenched bureaucratic corruption, and that is the problem that we're witnessing on the world stage. What corruption in as a government policy and practice really leads to. We're watching it.
Yeah.
Congratulations, Al. You got your wish. You've got your empire.
Now, when did FASB 56 go into effect?
I think it was about three. No, actually, it was right before Trump left office, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right.
So it was fairly late, I think, sometime in 2020, and it was during, if I'm not mistaken, it was during the COVID distraction,
Right. Or maybe just a little bit before.
or maybe a little bit before. I don't remember the
Yeah.
exact date.
Yeah.
I wish I did, but the timing, in other words, was very significant that they pulled that off.
Yeah, and it may have been presented to the president as a benefit because of it revealing what the actual, black budget was.
It may have been. Who knows? I don't know.
Right. And then
Um,
then you put it in place and all of a sudden nobody knows how much money the government's actually spending.
right. Exactly.
Right. Or where the
Exactly.
money's going out the back door.
Well, we know where some of it's gone out the back door. It's gone out the
Yeah.
back door to the Ukraine and probably been laundered right back into the pockets of corrupt politicians.
Right.
The whole Biden Ukraine Burisma, that whole thing is, I'm convinced, behind, and this is why this man uh, is not a good man, because he's literally has blood on his hands,
Yep.
and the money in his pocket is blood money.
Yep.
Um,
No
so
escape from that karma.
there's no escape from that karma. None.
Yeah.
None.
And you can see it in the way he's decayed.
You can see it in the way he's decayed, and you can hear it I heard a news article yesterday on the radio that somebody was calling Biden a devout Catholic. Well, if that's devout, we've lost all sense of what devotion to religious principle means, because there's nothing about the man that I can tell is even remotely adherent to the tenets of Roman Catholicism.
Well, maybe in
Uh,
the Francine sense.
well, yeah, maybe in the Francis sense,
Yeah.
but you know, to approve the thing he does, kudos to that Roman Catholic priest way back in the last election cycle, that when he went to mass and the priest wouldn't give him communion, and basically excommunicated him on the spot. Kudos to that priest, because he knew exactly what Biden was and is.
Yeah, the whole thing about these Democrat Catholics is just really it's profoundly
It's
demented.
it's profoundly demented. Yes, it is. And I'm all for not only reviving the good old tradition of public excommunication with all the ceremonial thereof. Within papal Catholicism, there is an old thing called the interdict,
Oh yeah.
which, in the case of certain political parties and countries, I would be all for reestablishing. Um, yeah. But the bottom line here is I think the problem geopolitically on the global stage is the United States of America.
Yep.
And the problem is, it has gone around the world, starting wars it cannot win, leaving nations wrecked and ruined. I mean, look at the effect of this war that we have pushed and prodded and coaxed the Ukraine into, and a war
Yeah.
that it could not and cannot win. On top of this, the degree of criminality and corruption in the unelected bureaucracy in this country, as we now know and have seen in the past 2 election cycles, is off the charts. And if you have a gangster government, if you have another Venice, then eventually that behavior catches up to you. And Kelly, I've been warning people and saying this for years. The country that this country in history most resembles is Venice. And we need to remember what happened to Venice during the High Renaissance, during a little thing called the War of the League of Cambrai.
Cambrai.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Webster
because,
Tarpley did a masterful study of
well,
that.
for those who don't know, the War of the League of Cambrai was basically Europe's first continent-wide war. And it was a war where everybody at that time that was a major power in the continent of Europe all ganged up together. They all formed this huge coalition to do one thing and one thing only. And that was to go after Venice and take it out once and for all, because everybody had had it with Venice's duplicity, criminality, corruption, war sponsoring, the whole 9 yards. And if you really want to treat folks, go read the preamble to the treaty that those European powers signed before they set off to war against Venice. Read the preamble to it, because it lays out all of their grievances against Venice, and see if they don't sound familiar.
Oh,
This
I
is
bet they
what
sound quite familiar.
Oh yeah, they sound very familiar. This is what the United States has become to the rest of the world. Um, we therefore must, as a matter of our national security and survival, drain that swamp.
Yeah, if we don't
And
drain that swamp, they're gonna wipe us all out.
they will end up creating havoc on a scale that is unimaginable.
Right.
And yeah, they have no regard for human life, not
Zero.
anywhere else in the world, and particularly here in this country. So they must, this is a situation that must be dealt with. Um, it's we haven't, Kelly, we have not seen this kind of criminality and corruption and disregard of human suffering since Reconstruction after the American Civil War. That's
Wow,
how
was it
it's
bad back then?
off the scale, off the scale. So this is much worse. Much worse.
Wow.
And
Well,
it was
and what
bad
what are
back
the
then.
factors that led to that? Was it the New World Order?
What do you mean?
Well, Bush's speech in '92 seemed to set this whole thing off.
It has been a goal for a very long time. You can go back prior to Bush's New World Order speech, but I know the speech that you're talking about, and it gave me chills, because what he was signaling in that speech is, yeah, I'm one of them, and I've just assumed power.
Yep.
This is one of the many reasons that the Bush family, I think, is kind of the center of a very nasty criminal network. But they've been grasping at this for a very, very long time, and it's really been the United States itself that has been the foundation of their power to launch into that global experiment. So in other words, we're dealing with a co-opted government. And I think in terms of
But
this
they shipped
kind of,
their power base offshore.
they shifted their power base offshore, but the base of military and financial power that they have created, I think really this began with Woodrow Wilson. He's the first one to embody personally a lot of these goals and to pursue them on the world stage, particularly after World War One.
Right. When
And
everyone was shocked.
when everyone was shocked, and he was an active participant in Versailles, and the creation of the income tax, IRS, and the Federal Reserve. Just in time for World
Just
War One.
just a
Just in
few
time.
just a few minor things like that.
Just a few minor things like that. So yeah, this has been going on a long time, and we have to realize that yeah, they've used our government and our country as their own cat's paw. The problem is, of course, is they bought into all of that free trade globaloney, that we inherited
Yeah.
from the British, and they shipped all of our manufacturing overseas. Well, you can't be a military power and have all of your heavy industry dependent on foreign based on foreign soil and dependent on the largesse of a foreign government.
Yep.
This is why Germany kept its heavy industry after the Second World War. This is why Russia still has heavy industry. And for that matter, look at Japan. They still have heavy industry. These countries are not stupid.
Yeah.
They still make their own cars and ships, and there's a reason they still make their own cars and ships, because you need that kind of production capacity if you do get into a war.
Yep.
So again, we've got to fix this problem, and we've got to reshore the industry.
You
And
were calling
yes,
for that way back in 2011, 2012.
absolutely I was. Absolutely
Yeah.
I was. And how do you keep heavy industry from going overseas? It's a little thing that this country practiced prior to and after the American Civil War called tariffs.
Yep.
Most people don't realize this. Prior to the American income tax, and the first one, by the way, levied by the Union during the Civil War. But prior to that, how did the federal government get its money? Well, it got its money from tariffs. Tariffs. And
Yep.
by the way, it was a tariff that really touched off the Civil War. So, you've got to handle them very, very carefully.
Yep.
But, that's a whole other history.
Well,
But the point is, we need to have our manufacturing base in this country if we're going to have a country.
right.
That is just that simple.
Well, we made so much money on tariffs that I believe in the 1890s they had to establish a commission to figure out how to spend it.
If I recall correctly, that's the case. I think it's about 1894, and I forget what
Yeah.
the name of the commission was.
Yeah.
I'm thinking too, if memory serves me correctly, that it had something to do with the people behind Wilson wanting to move from tariff to income tax.
Right.
There was some sort of connection, but I'm fuzzy on the details. I don't remember enough about it.
Yeah, it's hard to believe that, and the other thing about tariffs that people don't really realize is if you think of the country as a body, when you are shipping your capital offshore to pay for goods and services from someone else, you're basically draining your lifeblood,
Yes, yes,
which is exactly what we've seen.
yes.
But if you keep that money, that capital circulating in your own economy,
Right,
it pays salaries, it builds
right,
houses, it builds transportation. That capital is recirculated,
right.
and this whole offshoring process has damaged that recirculation pump.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. We're fat and sclerotic. And I
Yeah.
think I think the biggest clue to what you've just said about keeping money in the country and circulating is, I think, several states within the country are, we need to remember, in the United States, the deep state is not only the federal government, but each state has its own, so to speak, state deep state.
Yep.
And just read C. Wright Mills back in the 1950s in his book called The Power Elite. He points this out. Well, I think what you're watching with all of these states, beginning with Texas, and then it spread like wildfire. State bullion depositories, state resolutions on accepting gold and silver as legal tender and getting rid of sales tax on gold and silver. All of this stuff is happening I think precisely because people in the states have looked at the health of the federal government and looked at the health of the financial uh, situation in this country and concluded that we're headed off a financial cliff, and we simply cannot follow the federal government in falling off that cliff. We have to put into place some sort of infrastructure to be able to continue to have an economy and a functioning system of finance should everything fall apart. I think that's exactly what we're watching.
Well, there was also a change, I believe it was in 1994, where the secretly and quietly the bankers changed their position as a secured creditor of all of their customers' assets.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
And there's
There
now
were
20 states that are looking at addressing that at the state level.
Yes, yes. There were a lot of things that happened between 1988 and the mid 90s regarding the Federal Reserve System, the banks, and so on. And so I can remember when I used to get my canceled checks in the mail,
Yeah.
you know, um, and then the Federal Reserve decided, oh, we're not doing that anymore. You got to keep your own records.
Right.
You know, they have gone out of their way at every turn to screw the American people.
Yep.
We're just, we're pawns to them. The problem with running things that way is sooner or later you get a Spartacus, and this is the other problem. I think this country is in danger of that if real honest to goodness steps are not taken to fix this problem.
Yep.
It will blow.
Do you think the Doge is kind of like a Trojan horse for getting these problems on the table without having to talk about them explicitly?
In a certain sense, yes, because what is Doge?
Yeah, the Doge was the head of Venice.
The Venetian Doge was the head of the Venetian Republic, precisely.
Right.
There's
Yeah.
there's a little message being sent there, even in the title, that most people don't get.
Yeah.
And what is Doge? Well, it's the Venetian Italian dialect for what? Duce.
Oh, right.
Okay, so in other words, the Venetian Doge is the equivalent to the fascist Duce, who is, guess who? Our dear friend Benito Mussolini.
Oh, wow.
So in
That's
other words,
right.
yeah, that's right.
Well, the original name of Bank of America was Bank of America Italia.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So when they came out with this committee named Doge, I thought, oh, they're signaling that they really want to reconstruct Venice. As if they
Right.
haven't done a pretty good job of that already.
Right.
you know, have a city state in a swamp governing everybody else, all the surrounding territory, for its own benefit and acting as a big international player on the world stage, causing all sorts of madness and mayhem, and setting up secret FISA courts. Oh, pardon me, Doja courts, where you drop off your little secret denunciations of your neighbor any time of the day or night, and you get tried in secret by a team and panel of oligarchs.
Wow.
Does that
Yeah.
sound like America?
Sounds like a recent version of America.
Bingo. Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely. So, here we are. And I want to point out something. If people think I'm exaggerating this Venetian thing, I want people to remember that Gasparo Cardinal Contarini, a
Oh, yeah.
Venetian cardinal, wrote a little book about the government of the most serene Republic of Venice. It's a little known book. I have a copy of it.
Wow.
And the reason I have a copy of it is because that book was also widely read by the American founding fathers.
Floundering. Yeah.
Well, think Al Hamilton. So
Right.
in other
Who
words,
acted more like a British agent than he did like an American patriot.
ding, ding, ding. The first paragraph of the Federalist Papers, the very first paragraph of the very first Federalist paper written by our friend Al Hamilton. Does he use the word democracy? No. Does he use the
Nope.
word republic? No. What does he call the whole thing that he's setting up? An empire.
Yep.
Right there. So, in other words, yeah, I'm looking at everything that's going on domestically with a bit of a jaundiced eye. Um,
And
so,
Hamilton's system, which he established with the first Bank of the United States, was to give members of Congress shares in the
mhm.
bank.
Ding, ding, ding. Is it any wonder that Andy Jackson wanted to get rid of the whole dang thing?
And I
And,
remember
and
Jefferson when
finally
he came.
did.
I remember when Jefferson came back from Europe when he was, working on stuff over in France. When he came back, he was stunned
Uh-huh.
by the monarchist bent
Uh-huh.
of many of the people around the table when he came back, and he found himself the only one standing up
Uh-huh.
for decentralization.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. And that whole tension in American politics has really, in all honesty, never been resolved.
Right.
It, in a certain sense, it can't be resolved. There's, to put it bluntly, um, the union, and I'm quoting Glenn Beck here. The union isn't a suicide pact.
Right.
No one at that time that the current Constitution was ratified understood it to be, once you're in, it's like a Roman Catholic marriage. You can't get out of it.
Yeah. The only
You know,
choice you have is to live on the other side of the house.
yeah, that's the problem.
Yeah.
And the Civil War really did not address the legal issues of secession. It simply, by force of arms, says no, you can't do that. Well, at
Right.
some point, force of arms breaks down too. So, the situation has never really been resolved. And that's the other thing, I think, that with all of these states passing all of these currency things, and I think uh you're looking at states setting up a necessary infrastructure should they ever have to take those measures again. They're not going to do a repeat of the last time and not
Yeah.
have things ready to go if it comes to that. So,
Someone once said that you're doing the wrong thing when you look around and you're the only person who doesn't have somebody to dance with.
yeah, precisely, precisely. So, the country is in a very, very precarious situation. And I what I guess I'm trying to tell people is, don't let your guard down just because Trump was reelected. On the contrary, now is the time that you need to put the guard up. We haven't ended a phase. We've actually just begun a phase of American history. And we have to watch our federal and our state politicians very, very closely. Very closely.
Well, I think they're waking up to that a little bit.
Yeah, I think so. I think so.
They
Yeah,
had an interview with Murkowski where she basically said, "Where are all these people coming from? Then why do I feel like my job is at risk?" You know?
because it is, lady.
Yeah.
We don't want any more Mitch McConnell, John
Yeah.
McCain, Rhino Republicans, and for that matter, we don't want any more Chuck Schumers either. Oily, smarmy, uh, go along with the narrative to get power types of people. We don't want them anymore.
Right.
To me, it is a
The
sign of
slumbering
how.
giant is awake.
Yeah, this was a cultural election. This is why I say, don't think that American electoral politics are going to go back to the same old, same old. Not after this election. Mr. Trump is riding a cultural wave.
Yep.
He is a symbol of it, but he is not equivalent to it. And that's the
Correct.
mistake most people are making with this election. They think that this was all about Trump. It was not about Trump. It
No,
was about the culture.
Trump is the bull we sent into the china shop. No pun
Yes,
intended.
yes, exactly. It's exactly what he is. It could have been done by anybody else that was willing
Right.
to pick up the mantle. And to his credit, I think Mr. Trump didn't didn't realize that in his first term. He realizes it now.
Yeah.
There's no way he's unaware of it. And that's
He's
really
paying a
what
lot.
has. Go ahead.
He's paying a lot more attention to his bench right now than he ever has.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. He realizes that he has to create a deep bench. And so far, from that standpoint of things, I look at the Republican bench and then I look at the Democrat bench. The
Yeah.
Republicans have a deep bench. The Democratic bench, there's not a team sitting on those benches.
Yeah.
It's like the field, the entire team that was there has crossed the field and gone over to the other side. So what do they have left? They have Chuck Schumer, Gavin Newsom, Gretchen Whitmer, and a bunch of other, and that's it basically at the national level. And then they
Yeah.
have a bunch of crazies and kooks.
Yeah.
So they have to get a deep bench back, and the other thing they need to do is they need to move genuinely back toward the center. They're not going
Yeah.
to be able to pull off another Bill Clinton. Let's have a governor's conference and pretend to move to the center, and then once we get elected, yeah, we'll try and ram Hillary care down everybody's throats.
Yeah.
Uh, they can't do that because that's not going to save the party. That will not save the party. They may
Yeah.
go the way of the Whigs, and it may be the Republican Party that splits. Who knows? I don't know, but we're in for some very interesting times.
So did how did Mr. Obama do in the current election scenario?
I don't think he did well at all because I personally am of the view that this avatar presidency was primarily his third term,
Wow.
and most people suspect he had something to do with the selection of the Ayatollah Kamalarki and, for that matter, the avatar presidency of Biden Joe himself.
Well, you had
And
Holder select Tim
right,
Walz.
right,
That tells
right.
you everything you need to know.
That tells you everything you need to know. So this
Yeah.
was really the Obama third term, and uh, if I were a major Democrat financer, contributor, donor,
Yeah.
and I perceive the wreckage that this presidency and the Obama, running interference secretly and quietly behind the scene, I would want nothing more to do with that.
Yeah.
So the other thing that we need to watch is where are these big Democratic donors going to put their money? If they put
Right.
it into more wokery projects, it's not going to work for them. It
Right.
will not work. So
Well,
they
the whole
need to get a
DEI thing's being sued out of oblivion anyway, based on fiduciary laws.
yeah, as it was inevitably going to happen.
Right.
So, if they think that they're going to be able to further radicalize the party and maintain power, it ain't going to happen.
Right.
So those donors have their work cut out for them. They've basically got to turn around a party which they have allowed to be radicalized. I mean, I go back to George McGovern, and I've been watching this slow meltdown of the Democratic Party ever since he won their nomination. And it gets progressively worse and worse and worse with each election cycle.
Yeah.
Um, so whether they're going to be able to turn it around, I don't know. All I'm saying is American politics just became very, very different in this last election.
Yeah.
Um, it's not going to be the same kind of politics going forward because now, like it or not, cultural issues are going to be front and center in a way that they never were before.
Right. Yeah. So, did you see Mark Andreessen's or hear Mark Andreessen's recent interview with Joe Rogan?
No.
Yeah, it's fascinating and well worth anyone's time to go find that on YouTube or Rumble. Basically, one of the things he said was that he was shared what the Kamalarki plan was in the event that she won. And he said that basically they were going to shut the United States down to 3 or 4 corporations, kind of like the way Sweden is run,
Mm-hmm.
where you only have like 3 or 4 companies that you deal with for everything.
Mm-hmm.
And all the other startups, including startups for AI, were going to be limited to like 2 or 3, and they didn't want any, private investor money going into any AI startups or any other small businesses. They were basically going to completely shut down the small business sector.
Mm-hmm.
And he said that when he got out of that meeting, he talked to his colleagues and he says, "We've got to support Trump."
Mm-hmm.
And that was his big moment. It's like, this is their plan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't doubt it. You're dealing with typical Marxists.
Right.
They want their big state-owned corporations.
Yep.
Essentially, that's what they were doing and going to try and do, and that couldn't have been better news to America's technological and financial competitors,
Correct.
because it would have absolutely put us in the position to be the next big Argentina.
Right.
And that's not going to compete with China. That's not going to compete with Indonesia or Japan or India or Russia. It
Right.
just it ain't going to work.
Right.
So I'm not surprised. Whether people have to get it through their heads, and I hope it's beginning to dawn on them. This is a radicalized Jacobin Marxist party.
Ding, ding, ding.
There's no other way to qualify it. And it
Well,
will only survive if it is successful in shedding that perception of itself. And the only way it can do that is to make a genuine, real change.
right. A
The only way.
disavowal.
A disavowal of all
And,
of that crap.
and getting rid of all the people that
Yep.
were sort of engineered into place to promote it.
Yep. Yep. I don't see it doing that. I think
Yeah.
I think their machinery now at this point is, look what they did to Bernie Sanders. Say what you will
Right.
about Bernie Sanders, he was a challenge to that system, even though
Right.
his ideas are part of it.
Right.
But the problem is they have so entrenched themselves into power by doing things that way. I don't see that they will be able to make that kind of fundamental change.
Interesting.
The last time they were in this position, what happened? Well, Bill Clinton pretended to make that change with his governor's conference, and then he ran for the presidency as a centrist Democrat. Well, he was anything but.
Right.
It was purely cosmetics. But
Right.
that solution, having tried it with Clinton, ain't going to work anymore.
Yeah, with the IC in the background.
Bingo. It just is not going to work anymore.
Yeah. And
So,
that's sort of the elephant in the room under the rug is, is what happens with respect to reform of, intelligence agency
right,
priorities.
right, right.
Yeah.
The big problem that I guess people need to take away from what I'm suggesting here is that things are poised on the razor's edge, and the country could go in directions that few people could scarcely believe possible. And to illustrate what I mean by that, imagine for a moment the scenario had the Ayatollah Kamalarki been elected, and go beyond just the scenario that you mentioned. If they had been elected and put into place that corporate scenario and all the wokery, do you think for a moment that some American states were going to roll over and play dead and accept it?
Right. It was the wedge.
It was a wedge, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Most of the states that I think are behind this quiet push for uh, nullification laws and gold and silver legal tender and all that stuff and all the traps that those things are doing. Most of those states, I think, would have done something to block that entire agenda as much as they could. Uh, so again, I think the country is in a very, very bad way. If we get another radicalized government like we had, I think it will. I think it will de facto crack apart, if not de jure.
Yeah.
So this is a do or die moment culturally, and I
Hmm.
think I think the incoming Trump people know this, that they've got to get a handle on this thing before it spins out of control.
Yeah. Well, job one is rule of law,
Yep, exactly, exactly.
which is, back in 2017 or late 16, you and I had a private conversation, and I suggested that Trump first act is to go over to the Justice Department and review everything that's
Yep.
going on over there.
Yep.
And look where we are, 8
Well,
years later.
8 years later, it's looking to me like he's listened to your suggestion and taken it seriously. That this is something that has to be done,
Yeah.
and it needed to be done. I mean, go back to the Reagan era and the corruption scandals surrounding his Attorney General Ed Meese. I think that's
Oh,
where a lot of this. I think that's where a lot of this began.
really?
Because yes, absolutely. Who was Attorney General when the Inslaw software program was stolen?
Oh,
Ed
right.
Meese.
Iran
Where
Contra.
Iran Contra? Where was the whole Iran Contra operation run from? From the Department of Justice Situation Room using what? Promise Software. Who was doing
Right.
it? Ollie North.
Right.
So in other words, all of this corruption that we're seeing now, I think is stuff that you can trace at least to a certain degree back to the Reagan era and to the Reagan administration. So, you
And
want
also the
corruption,
Franklin scandal, the whole destruction of the
you
savings and loan.
you want corruption, think of Bill Casey
Right.
and think of him in bed during the interregnum years with
Oh, yeah, that thing.
with with Harriman. So
Yeah.
in other words, this corruption has been deep seated and it's been there for a long time.
Yeah.
And it's come home to it's Venetian style corruption. So,
Yeah.
you
Well,
know,
we can hope and pray that things get better, and also, just encourage people to let the people that have been emplaced and elected, whatever the case may be, understand the people's perspective.
yep, yep.
I mean,
This
that's
is
it.
this is not a time to let the guard down.
So you have a new book that's coming out. Any update on that? What's that book called?
The book is called The Rialto in Richmond. Um,
Or Richmond on the Rialto?
the Rialto in Richmond, yes.
Yeah.
The subtitle, I can't remember the subtitle right off the top of my head.
Yeah. They're usually pretty long, Joseph.
Well, I like long titles.
Yeah.
I like that 19th century style of publication.
It
Modern,
works well with social media too.
it works well with social media, and we've got to get out of the American soundbite mentality. We are one of the dumbest peoples on the planet because of that.
Yeah.
But no, it's a book about. It's going to be the first book in a possible series. I'm already working and researching the sequel, and I've already contacted the publisher about taking the sequel. So,
Wonderful. So when do we
Lord,
expect to see the Rialto book?
well, the Rialto is supposed to be coming out next month. Although I did hear that it might be out this month sometime, but I haven't heard anything
Yeah.
yet about it. So it's
Yeah,
supposed
well,
to
you
be.
can go up to Adventures Unlimited, folks,
Yeah,
and
it's
place
there.
your pre-order. And the more pre-orders they get, the more priority they'll give it.
Yeah, that's it needs to come. I wish it would have come out, for the Christmas season and particularly for the election. It deals with a lot of financial stuff, but it's um I knew during the writing of the book I'd probably have to do a sequel.
Yeah.
And I have found some stuff that I uncovered stuff in the writing of the book that led to places that I didn't want to cram into that book,
Yeah.
and that I was able to verify after having finished the book. So
Well,
I still,
my first inclination is to the hijinks of the North and the South and that whole
well, yeah,
period was with Lewis, was Meriwether Lewis, I believe, and what happened to him, I think, on the Missouri Road.
yeah, yeah. Well, the Louisiana Purchase does not enter into this book in any sort of direct way. I strongly suspect that there is something there that relates to finance.
Right.
Simply because, as I pointed out in a webinar on my website, simply because the man that edited the journals of Lewis and Clark was none other than Nicholas Biddle,
Oh, yeah.
the chief executive officer of the Second Bank of the United States.
Yeah.
So there's something going on there, clearly.
Yeah, as well as the big patent fire they had back there too.
Well, there's all sorts of stuff going on, but
Yeah, there was a fire in the patent building that a lot of those original American patents were all lost.
I can believe it.
Yeah.
Our
Well,
wonderful people.
Joseph, I really, really enjoyed talking to you today. I really appreciate the depth of your thinking on these things. And if people are and they absolutely should be interested in knowing more, what's your website?
The website is www.gizadeathstar.com. That's all one word, GIZADEATHSTAR.com.
All right.
And all my books are there. Yeah.
And Shiloh's good.
I mean, Shiloh's fine.
Yeah. Well, Joseph, thank you very much for being on the Common Surface, and
Yeah.
we look forward to talking to you again.
All right. Thanks for having me, Kelly. Bye-bye.
All right.
Okay, my friend, go to your meeting.
Yeah, I gotta get going. Yeah. Thanks, Joseph.
Have a good meeting. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye.